Okay, so that looks like the recording started. Okay, brilliant. So, firstly, thank you very much for taking time out of your day. I know for some of you it's around lunchtime. For some of you in the UK, it's sort of time to be thinking about going home. So I do appreciate you joining this session today. Let me swap screen. So today we're just going to be talking about planning for success and safety. So effective safety assurance strategies. So how do we go about applying these types of safety standards that we've talked about previously onto our projects? So more than happy to take questions. Ideally, if we could wait until the end, that'd be great, just because I'm working on one screen, so it's a bit hard to sort of see different questions popping up in the chat and people raising their hands. So more than happy to take questions. We'll do that at the end of the slides. We'll also should be able to put this recording up on our website as well, so we'll make sure we get that link sent out to you afterwards as well. So just into these sessions don't last too long, generally me talking for about 40 minutes or so, ask some questions and see how we get on from a timing perspective there. So in terms of what we'll be going through, so we'll talk about the requirements for safety planning, making sure that we build in all of the good safety assurance activities early on, as early on as we can into our programs. We'll talk about some of the content of safety plans, and then what we try and wrap these sessions up with is the one big thing. So what thing do we think we need to take away from the session today? So in terms of the requirement for safety plans, in terms of what we're looking at today, we're going to be looking at the requirement for safety planning activities in terms of how that's captured within a common safety method for risk evaluation and assessment. So that's a EU and UK regulation. We'll be thinking about it in terms of the Canadian method for risk evaluation and assessment for railway systems. So that standard that's been around for about 2.5, 3 years now. And also we'll be thinking about it in the context of EN 50126, which is one of the European Senelec standards as well. So we've got the life cycles for Senelec in the middle of the screen, and for those of you more familiar with CSM and CMREA, we've got that risk management process on the right-hand side. For those of you that are on the call, if you wouldn't mind just sort of going on mute as well, just to sort of limit any background noise, that'd be fantastic. Just hear a few little bits and pieces. So again, for those of you familiar with CSM, CMREA, they follow the same risk management process, just a few little tweaks in some of the phrasing here and there. So this is the context in terms of what we'll be looking at today. So when it comes to CSM, for what we use in Europe and in the UK, and also CMREA used in Canada, when it comes to safety plans, that regulation, that standards, actually, they don't specifically talk about and explicitly ask for a safety plan. What they actually sort of say is the first step of the risk management process shall be to identify in a document to be drawn up by the proposer the different actors' tasks and their risk management activities. The proposer is responsible for coordinating close collaboration between the different actors involved. So they don't specifically use the term safety plan, system safety plan, safety assurance plan, engineering safety management plan. It's got lots of different names that we're used to using, but CSM and CM don't specifically call upon a document by that name, unlike something like a system definition, which and it has a record which it talks about all the way through those standards. So for those of us that have been sort of working on safety assurance projects before CSM and CMREA came out, we've always been used to the concept of using safety plans and system safety plans. So essentially, that is what we're talking about when they use that phrase here in CMREA. So that's why we're still very much using safety plans when it comes to trying to demonstrate compliance to CSM and CMREA. On the flip side of that, when it comes to, the blue box in the top right-hand corner, so because it doesn't specifically use that phrase, what I've just highlighted on that process chart in the top right-hand corner is that generally we would start to develop that safety plan at the same sort of time that we would be generating our system definition document. So whilst it's not on the risk management framework, generally we always start generating the safety plan at the same time as system definition. And like the system definition, we'll be keeping that updated all the way through the life cycle of our project. On the flip side, from a Senelec perspective, so in terms of compliance to 50126, so 50126 specifically does mention the requirement to generate a safety plan, and that states that that safety plan is to be generated in phase 2 of the V life cycle. So what we've got highlighted there in the blue box, and Senelec also therefore says that the safety plan will be generated through the life cycle up until phase 9. So once we get to that system validation cycle as we start to go up the middle of the V. So it specifically talks about a safety plan, and it specifically states that we need to keep it up to date all the way through the life cycle. Okay, so it's quite different from CSM and CMREA, which is very silent on it, apart from that one sentence I showed you on the previous slide. So Senelec 50126, it also talks about what information should be captured in a safety plan. So in one particular section of 50126, it's actually got a section dedicated to the types of information that should be captured in a safety plan. So then when we talk about if we're using CSM and CMREA, even though we might not be using 50126, even though we might not have been asked to comply to the 50126 standard, the contents of the safety plan that it talks about would still be very much relevant to a project demonstrating compliance to CSM or CMREA. So what 50126 talks about in terms of the content of a safety plan is that it shall define the following types of safety activities. So just something to be aware of. So what we've got listed on the left-hand side, it doesn't strictly follow word for word the structure defined in 50126, but it does accurately capture the requirements for the content of the standard. So brief introduction, talk about system definition, so what it is that this safety plan defines to relates to in terms of the change that we're making to the railway, roles and responsibilities, the risk management process, hazard management, safety approvals, acceptance and audits, safety assurance deliverables, lifecycle activities, and then a little bit about timelines as well. And what we'll do is we'll take a bit of time now just to sort of go into those in a little bit more detail, and that's where hopefully we'll be able to sort of go through maybe some tips and tricks and just various other sort of good practice things that we've sort of picked up on over the years that we feel makes, you know, for some good safety plans that we can follow throughout our project. So in terms of the introduction, so I know some of this might be going back, I suppose, a little bit to basics for those of you that use this quite often, but based on the people that we've had sign up to the session, we've got a mixture of people that have been doing for safety for a lot longer than I have, but also people for which this is quite new to. So we're sort of trying to make sure that we're covering it for all various people that have signed up. So we want to understand what the purpose of our safety plan is. So why are we generating it? So in terms of what regulations, what standards, what guidance notes maybe that it is we're trying to demonstrate compliance against, because obviously depending on the type of projects we're talking about, the type of country we're in, that's going to involve making sure that we're trying to demonstrate compliance to different laws, regulations and standards. What's the scope of the safety plan? So that can be really important in terms of at what level is this safety plan sitting. So what I mean by that is that if we have maybe like a large program of works, it could be that we have a large program of works like in the UK, it might have been Great Western Electrification, which was covering 100 miles of new electrification, Midland Rail Hub program, which was made up of lots of different interventions, Go expansion program in Canada. If we're sitting at the program level, then there could be a lot of high level generic information that we could capture in our program level safety plan. Or alternatively, if we're delivering one of these smaller projects that sit within the program. We just need to make it clear what our scope is and how that fits into the wider safety assurance regime that we might be working to as well. It could just be that we're a standalone project, not part of any other program, nothing sitting above or below us. We just need to make sure that that's really clear in terms of what the scope of this safety assurance plan needs to look like. If you've joined some of our previous webinars, we've talked a little bit about significance decisions. So again, I'm sure quite a lot of you are familiar with the term significance from a CSM or a CMREA perspective. So that's really just looking at how does this project fare in terms of that significance decision. And again, as most of you are aware, if a project is deemed to be significant, then that's when we need to follow this risk management process. And then we also need to appoint either an assessment body from UK terminology or an independent safety assessor from Canadian sort of terminology. So it's really good to just capture in this safety plan what the output of that significance decision was, because then we know fairly early on from reading this document whether or not we need to appoint an assessment body or an ISA, or if one has already been appointed, we can then just also capture here that project has been deemed significant under this application number. We have therefore also appointed company X to be our independent safety assessor, etc. In terms of reviews and updates, so how often are we going to be updating our plan? Again, that is going to be very much dependent on the type of project we're looking at, and if it's something that's a short, sharp project, or it could be a large and complex program that's going over a number of years. How long are we going to keep it up to date? How often are we going to keep it up to date? And are we going to also therefore be giving it a review again and an update at the end of each life cycle? So normally at the end of each project life cycle, we'd want to update our safety plan to make sure that what we've written previously is still valid. But also it could be that if there's a change of scope in terms of the project that we're delivering, whether or not scope gets taken away, scope gets added, again, that might trigger us to have a review of our safety plan before we wait until we get to that end of the particular phase of the life cycle. So it's good to just make clear in this particular section that we understand what it is we're going to do as a project in terms of making sure that we keep this information up to date as we go through. Not to try and sort of hammer the point too much with it, but when we sort of get to the end of our project, well, it could be the end of a life cycle phase, so it could be at the end of detail design, it could be just before commissioning. We might be wanting to write some sort of safety case, and one of the prime purposes of a safety case, future webinars come, is to also demonstrate how we're complying to what we said we would do in our safety plan. So it's almost like the proof that we've completed what we said we'd do in a safety plan. So if the safety case bears no resemblance to a safety plan that we wrote 5 years ago, then we're going to have a very hard time convincing an assessment body, an independent safety assessor, a system review panel that we've actually sort of done everything that we really thought we should be doing. Abbreviations, references sort of speaks for itself, really. So in terms of the system definition element of the safety plan, so this is really just to give a bit of a high level overview, again, in terms of the change that we're making to the railway, whether or not it's technical, operational, organizational change, or a mixture combination of both. Obviously, what we'd be looking to do is, again, mentioned earlier, just confirming whether or not we're looking at this program level or a particular smaller project or intervention level. We're not going to be going for war and peace within this section of the safety plan because, again, the right thing, easier thing to do is to make sure that we're referring out to our system definition document as well. That's the main document where we're capturing the scope and the change that we're making. If we start capturing that in lots of different places, then as soon as one thing changes, then we need to start changing it in lots of different documents. So brief bit of narrative here, maybe a few diagrams, pictures to help with a brief explanation, but then referring out to that system definition document as well. So then we start thinking about roles and responsibilities. So who has those roles and various responsibilities for helping to demonstrate and manage this safety assurance process through the project? So in terms of the types of things that we want to be thinking about in this section, it's things like the organizational structure. So understanding, sorry, actually, it's probably above that. Actually, it's what organizations are involved in the process. So is it like a network rail? What train operating companies are involved? Station facility operators, depending on the project. In the Metrolinx environment, it might be what sort of project co is involved and what their scope is. So it's just understanding the makeup of the organizations within the project, organizational structure from a team delivery. So what's the delivery team responsible for demonstrating safety assurance? And then we start to understand what information might therefore be required to start feeding in from different organizations into this sort of top level puzzle, making sure that we're bringing all of the pieces of the puzzle together. What are the key duties throughout the life cycle? Again, for the various actors that are involved, it could be that some projects do have dedicated safety assurance resource to help out. So someone like me coming in to help out on a project to do delivery, but not every project has that. So therefore the types of activities that a safety assurance engineer might perform on a project might be therefore disbanded out to other members of the project team. So we just need to be clear who it is delivering what. What interaction are we having with other internal stakeholders? So we've got mentioned there reliability, availability, maintainability. We've got quality. We've got CDM, which is a UK term for construction design management. So more of the sort of OHS health and safety side of things. Because again, we need to be making sure that safety assurance isn't just sitting within its own sort of little silo somewhere. We need to be talking about how we're making sure that this safety assurance process is getting integrated into the project or program. Interaction with external stakeholders. So again, depending on the project, the level that we sit within a wider program maybe, that's going to have an impact on what we talk about here from external stakeholders. But here we might be talking about how we as a network rail project might be having to go and interface with a train operating company or someone that operates and maintains a station. In the Metrolinx environment, it could be how we're dealing with TTC, Via Rail, other sort of stakeholders like that. Generally within this section, we'd have a RACI. So looking at who's responsible, accountable, consulted and informed for various safety assurance activities. So we've got an example of one of those in the top right corner. So that RACI has been taken from one of the Network Rail CSM standards, RSE 100.02. And that RACI, so we don't need to follow that RACI exactly, but if we can sort of just say where we're making tweaks as we need to, depending on the types of roles we've got on the project, whether or not there is a dedicated safety assurance resource to help do these activities. Again, it just helps us make sure that we're really clear on who is going to be doing what throughout the process. And then we'd be talking a little bit about competency as well. And that might just be, again, just referring out to where the competency of all of the various safety assurance people or project engineers, where that's normally demonstrated and kept. So sometimes that might just be kept on a SharePoint system that's got hold of everyone's sort of authorities to work to conduct the various roles that they have. The diagram that I've got in the middle of the bottom, so where it's got SIL 0, SIL 1, SIL 2, SIL 3, SIL 4. So that's taken from another CENELEC standard, another European safety standard. This one's related to software. So this came from 50128. 50128 has actually been replaced by another standard now, but I haven't actually updated this. I need to check to see if that diagram needs to change actually. So that's taken from an old software safety assurance standard. And what that's also demonstrating is, depending on the safety critical nature of the project for the delivery of a software intensive safety critical subsystem, there are certain rules that, depending on the safety integrity level that software for that system needs to meet, then that has certain requirements that must be met in terms of making sure that we separate roles of verifier, validator, and making sure that the independent assessor is also kept sort of away from the sort of project delivery team as well. So that sort of helps set some boundaries, and then we can use that type of independence layers that we need that's demonstrated there. We can build that and help demonstrate that we've met that requirement when it comes to developing that organizational structure as well. So again, that type of diagram might not play an awful lot, might not apply for the type of infrastructure program that we might be delivering. If we're delivering a new station, it's likely that we won't be talking about this type of roles and responsibilities, independent structure that we've got there from 50128. But if we are delivering a brand new software intensive signaling system, some sort of new computer-based interlocking system, then we'd be looking to sort of get into that level of detail to show how that we've met that sort of independence requirements. Okay, so then in terms of the risk management process element of our safety plan, so this is really talking about how we're going to be applying, sorry, I'll focus on CSM there, but the CSM, CMREA, or the CENELEC requirements, how are we going to demonstrate compliance to this risk management process for our specific application? So what CSM, what CMREA, it's good, it provides a good risk management framework, but it doesn't really talk about the who, the what, the why, the when. So some quite key information. It assumes a very linear process from generating a system definition to demonstrating compliance, and off we go off into the sunset. But how are we actually applying it to our specific project? And again, if we're applying CSM and CMREA for maybe the installation of a new bridge, a new overbridge, how that looks like is going to look very different if we're introducing a new computer-based interlocking or a new ETCS signaling system onto a brownfield railway. So two very different types of projects there following the same process, but the actual level of depth that we will need to go into to demonstrating that they're safe is a lot more intensive for that new signaling system as it would be for maybe installing a new overbridge on a railway line. So what techniques will we use to identify our hazards? So again, CSM, CMREA doesn't really sort of call up any particular technique. Most common one is that of hazard identification workshops. So is that it, or are we going to need to do others? Are we going to need to generate FAMICAs or any other sort of particular analysis to help understand our hazards and our risks? What other sources of information are we going to be using to help gather information on hazards and safety requirements? So again, you know, are we making use of past project information? In the UK, we've made use on previous projects of the RSSB safety risk model, and the SHAMWA. I always forget what SHAMWA stands for. Common hazards and something or other in an infrastructure involved. Yeah, I've forgotten what that acronym is. But there's lots of sources of information out there of hazard and safety requirements. That means that we don't have to be starting with a blank piece of paper. So how are we making use of that good information, and also accident investigation reports? There's lots of good information there that we might want to feed into our risk management process. We've got something there called UNISIG subsets. So if we're deploying ETCS, there are a whole set of standards that were generated at a European Railway Agency level that talks about how we then go and apply ETCS and what requirements that needs to meet when we apply it to specific application projects. And within those UNISEG subsets, there are specific standards that talk about hazards and safety requirements as well. So again, we're trying to demonstrate in our plan, which is going to be reviewed by an independent safety assessor or an assessment body. If our project's deemed significant, we're trying to demonstrate that we know what we're doing, where we're making good use of information, and that we're not trying to figure things out from scratch. And we also want to play back the use of how we're going to be applying risk acceptance principles, generating safety requirements, demonstrating compliance and through various stages of the life cycle. One of the things that we'll be talking about as well is that hazard management procedure. So again, we know that we've got to capture our hazards, the risks, our safety requirements, evidence, all that good stuff. We know we need to capture it in a hazard record, but what does that actually look like? And as you can see on the diagram on the right, and I'll try to like darken a few things out there because it's something that we use on a previous project. But how many hazard records are there going to be? Who owns what information's feeding into them? What information's getting transferred across to a different hazard record as part of the hazard transfer process? So again, sometimes you might have one project that just has one hazard record. It could be, depending on the project, you've got multiple hazard records feeding in to different ones that might be sitting at different levels of the project. So we need to understand the hierarchy of those hazard records. We need to understand how we're going to manage the flow of information between the two. Once we've got the information in there from our hazard identification workshops, they can't just sit there and we don't do anything with them until just before commissioning. So how often are we going to review them? Who are we reviewing them with? We need an awful lot of subject matter expertise help in making sure that we're generating the right safety requirements, that we're capturing the right evidence. So we need to talk about that as well. So again, the independent safety assessor doesn't just think that you've got a safety engineer or possibly a project manager, if you've given it to a project manager to do, just sitting there in their own little silo trying to come up with some stuff that they hope might be suitable. It's making sure that we've got all parties that are bought into it. Safety approvals, acceptance and audit. So this would be addressing what internal reviews need to happen, client reviews, again, depending on where we're sitting in the hierarchy of this of our particular project. Independent assessment, system review panels, safety audits. So what we're starting to talk about here is just making sure that, again, we understand what deliverables are going to be reviewed by what party. And this will feed in a couple of slides' time into what that also looks like from a timescale perspective. Won't explore that now. The diagram on the right, that's come from a Network Rail standard. That's come from the system review panel standard within Network Rail. And this just shows, again, what type of document we'd be looking to produce for what particular phase in the project. So for the Network Rail people amongst you, obviously it's still using the old CRIP terminology. It's also differentiating between a non-significant project, a significant project, and also an interoperable project. So for those of us in the UK, we also have to think about interoperability and whether or not our project is interoperable. We don't have that sort of law and regulation in Canada, but it just adds an extra layer of complexity, another set of technical requirements, another set of stakeholders that we need to deal with. So that's a separate differentiation in the UK. But it's good for helping us determine what documents need to be reviewed by who or what phase in the life cycle. The bits that I've got in the middle, that's not a complete diagram, so I just need to skip on a little bit further. Actually, no, let me go back a bit. So it can get quite complex as well. So some projects might just have one independent assessor. Happy days, easy. But again, sometimes when we're dealing with the commissioning of safety critical subsystems as well, then it can start to get a little bit messy in terms of the number of independent assessors that are actually involved in a project. So in this simple structure, we've got an infrastructure manager, so it could be a Metrolinx or a Network Rail, and then we've got a safety critical systems supplier, so it could be an Alstom, Hitachi, Siemens, others are available. So it's quite common that those that are developing and supplying safety critical equipment like a computer-based interlocking, they might have their own supplier ISA. They might actually have also an internal independent safety assessor. So they would be looking at this from a generic application, generic product level to make sure that the safety work has been done to a good level. But on top of that, the infrastructure manager might also have an overarching ISA. So someone that doesn't just sort of look at the system elements of it, but making sure that this is being integrated properly from an operations and maintenance perspective as well. So maybe has a slightly wider scope than the supplier's ISA, but doesn't necessarily get into as much detail from a technical systems perspective. If our project's interoperable, then we might also have something called a notified body, still the term from a European perspective, or an approved body, which is now what it's called in the UK. And that NOBO, APBO, they're responsible for doing independent assessments on whether or not there are certain technical requirements that we've met. So again, it could be that the safety critical system supplier has one of those, looking very specifically at their technical system. But then, yeah, the infrastructure manager might also have, I've missed a skip there. That order's wrong. So the infrastructure manager might also have an assessment body that's looking at compliance to CSM, whereas the independent safety assessor is looking at the more technical detail from a SENELEC perspective. And the infrastructure manager, if the project's interoperable, would also need an approved body and a designated body. Yeah, and it can get a bit messy and like independent assessor, like get-togethers and coffee mornings can be a really good idea to make sure that we're not sort of doubling up on people's work, and we've got clear boundaries as to who's doing what. This is why they create independent assessment plans, and making sure there's no overlap, but making sure that there's nothing that's falling through the gap as well. So all of these independent assessment activities, all of the reports that they generate, that would then have to feed into a system review panel, most likely similar in Network Rail and Metrolinx. But then also what we have to do in the UK is that if the project's interoperable, we then need to go to our National Safety Authority as well to get authorization. So with respect to our safety plan, we therefore need to make sure we're really clear on how all of this works and comes together and who's doing what. As I say, if you've just got the one independent safety assessor or the one ASBO, happy days. That diagram starts to look a lot simpler, and that section starts to look a lot shorter. So yeah, making sure we build all of that into our plan and we know who we need to keep happy. I've mentioned it before in terms of the independent oversight of an assessment body or an independent assessor, independent safety assessor is only applicable for those significant changes. And we've just got a few sort of tips here. These are, I guess, are kind of like more tips as to how to try and keep an independent assessor happy, but we can flip that around in our safety plan to talk about how we're going to have that early engagement. What types of progressive meetings are we going to be having with them? Are we going to be asking them for comment sheets for the key deliverables that we produce during the life cycle of the project, so that we can start to address any of their concerns early? Because again, those of you, I'm sure most of you are aware, one of the key outputs from an ASBO or an ISA is this safety assessment report. So if we have really bad engagement with them, we don't give them anything to review until we get close to a commissioning, they might give us a safety assessment report that isn't supportive of the work that we've done. And then we're in trouble, then we're working on the back foot. So if we can start to progressively work with them, address their comments early, keep our documents updated as we go along, submit things to them on time, then we've got a much better chance of getting that supportive safety assessment report that we then need to take to our system review panel. Fortunately, it's not something that I was working on, but one of the more scathing one-liners that I've seen from an independent safety assessor to a project is, good safety plan, shame you didn't actually do anything like what you said you would do on the actual project delivery. So they will go and check that stuff. You know, it's no good having a perfect safety plan if you then leave it on the shelf and don't update it, don't follow it. You know, they are going to be checking this all the way through that life cycle to make sure you've done what you said you'd do. That's that one. So life cycle deliverables. So this is very much based, again, Network Rail. The clue might be in the title there, I guess. So these are the phases from the Network Rail PACE process. So this doesn't necessarily align completely, lose my words, neatly with the Metralinx life cycle, but from the titles of it, you get the idea as to what we're trying to achieve at each of these phases of the life cycle. And what we've got here by the coloured activities is when we'd ideally be looking to start generating our documents, and the fact that we need to keep them up to date as we go through the process. Okay, the items in blue are generally those activities, those documents produced by the independent safety assessor, the assessment body. The only caveat to that is that the remit item, that should have been coloured orange. So that should have been a infrastructure manager, that should have been an end client deliverable. So the end client would write the remit for the independent safety assessor. Once they come on board, the independent safety assessor would write their assessment plan, and then at various phases of the life cycle produce that safety assessment report. So that just gives a bit of a feel of the types of deliverables that we'd produce throughout the life cycle for a significant project. In terms of what therefore our suppliers should be submitting, so these activities here would normally be led by the proposer, the sort of end client, as it were. But as we've talked about previously, there's a lot of information that would need to be fed into that from the rest of the project. So what that looks like, again, massively differs depending on the types of projects that we're working on, which is why it's really good to try and capture that in the plan so that we're not sort of left guessing as we're going through the process. It could be that some of the suppliers are just purely delivering their day-to-day engineering assurance deliverables. So like their design drawings, their from a UK point of view, like their Form 5s, their Form Bs, Form Es, that they're producing at detailed design, at commissioning, at handover. It could be that they just need to produce that information because that's the information that we need to demonstrate compliance against our safety requirements. Again, if we're getting into the realms of having safety critical system suppliers work with us, then generally their safety management processes internally will say that they also need to prepare their own safety plans. They would need to run their own hazard identification sessions, and therefore that is ultimately going to result in them producing something maybe like a specific application safety case. So that specific application safety case, that's something that we as an end client needs to be thinking about as well, because it could be that that specific application safety case contains a number of conditions that we still have to generate compliance against. So there might be a number of safety related application conditions that they have written in their specific application safety case. So I'm not trying to make this more complicated than it needs to be. But then we need to demonstrate compliance to them, because it could be that they say, right, well, you need to go and maintain the system every other day for us to say that it's going to be safe. So, okay, as the end user of that, how are we demonstrating compliance to that requirement of maintaining that system every other day? How can we demonstrate that we have met that requirement? Because that is not in the sole gift of the safety critical system supplier to do that. Okay, it needs help from the end client to demonstrate that that sort of requirement is met. Bad example, right? You probably would have bought another system that you sort of get the idea that there are sometimes things that they need to transfer out to the end users to confirm that they're happy that their system is going to be deployed safely. Safety assurance lifecycle activities. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but what we've done is a bit of an exercise to try and map out a number of different life cycles. So we've got Senelec, Network Rail, PACE, HS2, some REBA stages. Not everything matches up neatly, but what we've tried to map out here is the types of activities and the types of deliverables that we'd be looking to produce at different phases of the life cycle. So again, if we can talk about that in our safety plan and what specific activities and deliverables we're doing at each phase of our life cycle, then again, that just demonstrates to the independent assessors and to our system review panels that we've got a clear understanding as to what we need to generate as we go through the process. But not just from a project team perspective, but also there's a few ideas there in terms of what we'd expect from the independent assessors as well. So as I say, we don't have time to go through each of those, but you'll see that on the slides when that comes out. And then, as we've sort of mentioned a bit earlier, especially when we start to get lots of different parties involved, we need to start thinking about the timeline considerations. So this isn't necessarily just saying that we expect to commission the system in November 2025. You know, things like that can very quickly go out of date. But it's really just trying to make sure that we've really given some good consideration and we've factored in the different review times, the different review cycles needed by each of these stakeholders. So very quickly, just to sort of hopefully make a little bit of sense, if we've got an independent safety assessor or an assessment body, if that then needs to go to a system review panel and then possibly another panel after that or a national safety authority, it's not uncommon for an independent assessor to require 8 weeks to review your documentation and then produce their safety assessment report. It may well be that then the system review panel wants another 4 weeks to review your submission and the safety assessment report produced by the independent assessor. If it then goes to another party after that, it could be an MSCC or a national safety authority. They might need another 2 or 4 weeks, 8 weeks for a national safety authority in the UK. We're already taking, what's that? I don't know, minimum like 14 weeks of review periods before we get to our commissioning date. And then if we've got various stage works, which is what we've tried to, I mean, we've taken this from a project that we worked on a number of years ago. We've got quite a number of different stage works. Some were significant, some weren't. There can be an awful lot of overlap of activities. So how are we going to manage that? How are we going to not swamp everyone as we're coming towards the end? So if we can start to visually lay that out, include those sorts of timescales in the process, then again, it helps us feed into our program activities to making sure that we're giving all of these independent bodies enough time to do their activities and their reviews. Because the last thing that they want is for us to submit something to them with 2 weeks to go, right? That's not going to help anyone. You're putting them under pressure. There's a very high chance that you're going to get an unsupportive SAR. So when you're submitting your documentation, possibly 14 weeks out, at that particular point, we want to be saying, well, actually, this is everything that we've got, but we're in control. This is what we still don't have, but this is what we're expecting to come in. This is when we expect it to come in. This is how we're going to validate it so that we know that we're good to go at the point of commissioning. The mistake a lot of projects can do is that they don't have very much evidence here. And then it's like, oh, not everything's closed now, hazard record. So that's not going to work. So they wait to get as much information as possible. But then this commissioning date hasn't changed. And then you sort of really put in the assessment bodies and the system review panels under pressure. And that's generally not going to go very well, right? Because it could be that you don't get your final bits of closeout evidence for your hazard record, until the actual night of commissioning as well. So again, just some important considerations that we need to be thinking about when it comes to our safety planning activities. And then the one thing, for those of you that have been some of these webinars before, I can never stick to one thing. So I've got 3 this time. So key things really. So if we don't have a robust safety plan, then it's hard for us to convince our stakeholders that we've identified all of those reasonably foreseeable hazards. We need to understand the hierarchy of the safety assurance activities. Again, from some of those diagrams, you can see it can get quite complex. So we need to be clear as to how we're bringing everything together, again, to make sure things aren't falling through cracks. And what I've just mentioned as well, you know, that I still see lots of programs with safety assurance isn't built into a program at all, let alone all of these types of review periods. So we need to make sure that we're getting all of that included as well in our safety plans. So that's it from me. I'm going to stop sharing that. So that was a bit of a quick whistle-stop tour. Oh, there's still some of you here. Oh, how good. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour of safety plans and the types of things that we need to factor in to our document, to our safety plans that we're generating. Sorry, you can tell I'm probably trying to do 2 things at the same time here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take some questions. I'm just going to very quickly, before I forget, I'm just going to put a feedback form into the chat, because obviously we'd really appreciate your feedback so we can, you know, hopefully make these free webinars a bit more useful to people. So I've just put that in the chat. And then just the only bit of promo I'm going to do is, I suppose, if there's anyone that's interested in a day's course, then we've got one of those as well. So that's in the chat if you want to go and have a look at it. So, but that's all I'm going to do from that perspective. There aren't any questions in the chat, so that's fine. Hopefully there are some of you that are still awake. I can see Kivan. Apologies if I've not said that right. Kivan, I think you've got a question.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure if you hear my voice.
Yes, I can. Yeah, no worries.
Where the term hazard ID is coming from?
Sorry, can you say that again about hazard IDs?
The acronym hazard ID workshop. What's the source of that methodology? Because CMRE, I mean, CENELAC definitely doesn't talk about that. CENELAC has hazard.
Yeah, and there isn't a massive amount of difference in the two. In terms of the original origin of Hazard ID, I don't entirely know. I know from a Yellow Book perspective, which was an old UK engineering safety management manual before CSM came along, you know, that talked about hazard identification workshops and things like that as well, but that would have got it from somewhere else. And there are European standards that talk about HAZOPs and various other things like that.
Yes. If I may.
Yeah, sorry, go on, please. Yeah.
In fact, 5126 mentions HAZOP, and for HAZOP references IEC 61882, I believe. And if you look at that document, it talks about the benefits of HAZOP at different stages, life cycle stages, and it clearly says that its primary use is at the end of a detailed design, not at the beginning of the project. Whereas you see many projects, they take Hazard ID as a shortcut instead of doing the proper preliminary hazard analysis, system hazard analysis. They jump into the Hazard ID and they come up with a bunch of safety requirements. They call it, and that leads to my second question. I don't want to take too much of time. Military standards.
Mm-hmm.
Again, in your presentation, you didn't bring up military standard 882. Whereas that's referenced in CENELAC for hazard analysis. The CENELAC doesn't give you the list of all hazard analysis needs to be done, but it references military standard, and military standard describes the safety plan, hazard management plan, all of the safety hazard analysis. And for safety planning, also we look at the military standard recommendation for inputs and outputs of safety plan.
Yeah. So just yeah, agreed. So hazard identification. So I'm a big believer in doing hazard identification all the way through the life cycle. So including having workshops early in the process. But I don't like doing hazard identifications at very early design stages if you haven't done that preliminary hazard analysis first. But again, CSM, CMREA, they don't mention the term at all. So it's very silent on it. So where I was sort of talking about where you might take information from lots of other sources to help feed into your project, that would be what I would call part of our preliminary hazard analysis activities. But yeah, from a terminology perspective, yeah, CSM and CMREA is very silent on it. From the MIL standard 882. So yeah, so from the UK perspective, that's hardly ever seen in any sort of project documentation. I guess that's just because maybe there's been a lot more use of compliance to network rail standards, the European Senelec standards. There's not really been much history in the MIL standard or the DEFSTAN equivalent that we have in the UK military. But again, from the US and Canadian perspective, there's sorry, what was I going to say? There's a lot more history in the railways that came from using the good practice from the MIL standards, 882. So
US
there's
FDA.
yeah. So there's a lot
US
more.
FDA regulation is all based on 882.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the Federal Transportation Authority. Yeah, so agency. Sorry. So yeah, so there's a lot more history of that from a Canadian perspective, but we are and US perspective, but we're certainly starting to see more so in Canada, and most of the work I do is in Toronto. So I've not done too much on the West Coast with TransLink and also over in like Edmonton, Calgary area. But most of the stuff that we're seeing in Toronto is much more going towards Senelec and CMREA. So again, the types of terminology that you might be used to seeing in 882 isn't really called up anymore. But absolutely, if it came to getting into the sort of detailed analysis and some of those other documentation, there's no reason why you couldn't go and start looking at those other documents, because it's good to take best practice from other industries as well and help therefore. So yeah, I certainly think that there would be viable sources to help in those safety activities. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, some really good points there, Kevan. Thank you. Rohan?
Hi, Damon.
Hi, Rohan.
So my question is more related to like getting a better understanding of the Canadian industry, how we can better come to, for example, you mentioned hazard data sets and subsets that can exist, so we don't have to start from scratch. But in the Canadian railway industry right now, one of the challenges that we face is that there's not a lot of data available, so that we can actually put a quantitative metric to what is considered an acceptable risk. And there's a lot of times where we're coming across this where we know it's safer in comparison to the other systems that already exist, but because we don't have the numbers to back it, we end up in this often stalemate where we're trying to convince them, and then it's like a back and forth. So with that perspective being said, I wanted to inquire, how are there according to your knowledge, data subsets that are now accepted as part of CMREA standards that are already being used? And if not, which ones will fall under that jurisdiction where we can potentially consider using those subsets and the potential future you see?
Yeah, so I think so from a oh sorry, money run out in the meter, I think, for the lights. Yeah, so in the UK we've had the safety risk model, and we've been fortunate enough that we've had that for probably about 20 years or so now. And obviously our country is a lot smaller, and it's been sort of developed on a sort of national basis. So we've been very lucky that when we've needed to sort of ever get into the detailed quantitative type analysis, that we've had that type of information available to us to use. It's not too often, that being said, that I've had to go into the very detailed quantitative analysis in the various projects that we've worked on. An awful lot of it has been where we've been demonstrating compliance to particular standards and how we've met certain safety requirements. So it's not too often that you necessarily have to get into that level of detail. However, I don't think that there's, say, like, there isn't a data set that CMREA would refer out to from a Canadian perspective. And again, this is where my sort of, I suppose, my knowledge of what goes on in like Edmonton, Calgary, and TransLink is maybe a little bit lighter than I'd like it to be. But I know that in Metrolink's world, they're also going that they are, well, I think they have also developed now a safety risk model for the Metrolink's environment. I've not seen what that looks like, but I know that that's been under development for a little while now, and I think they use that as to form some of the basis to their sort of annual reports and safety metrics. But I've not unfortunately seen that used on the projects to start to use that quantitative type output to demonstrate that something's is maybe safer than a different option or something like that. So I think at the moment it's going to be very much dependent on what each like transport authority, depending on their sort of what province they're operating. I think it's going to be sort of on a independent basis.
Okay, so as opposed to the SRM that is like standardized for the entirety of England, you're suggesting that ours is going to be more provincial based?
Well, I don't know that for
Or
sure,
even
but that's what I've
okay,
seen. You know,
okay.
I've seen that Metrolinx have been developing one. And
And
I'll be honest, Rohan, I don't know if like TransLink have already got one of those on West Coast or if they're developing it. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you at the moment. I just know that Metrolinx have been developing their own one.
okay, and so from what it's sounding like is the few times that you've had to do the quantitative, you've been pre-provided with data sets, or
Yeah.
like
So
the organization gives it to you.
yeah. So again, it all works a bit differently, I guess. But in the UK, so our company in the UK is a corporate member of the Rail Safety and Standards Board, so we pay a certain amount of money to get easy access to all their research papers, blah 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 blah. And part of that is that we get easy access to the safety risk model. So we have so each company that's a member of it, they have logins for their teams. We can log in, we can download that information, other research papers, and then use it as we see fit. We can also speak to the RSSB to sort of almost get them to do like an independent check to make sure that we're using it in the right way. Again, not done that very often at all, but
You did
so
that
it
for
is
Canadian projects? You
no,
use
no,
the
no. So
R as
that's
just for
no,
purely
just
England?
for UK, yeah.
Okay.
Where we have used the RSSB safety risk model and other research has been mainly to help with having hazard checklists. So
Hazard
these
checklists.
data sets have got really, really detailed stuff. So again, as part of what we were talking about just a bit ago with Keyvan, was from that preliminary hazard analysis point of view, why start with a blank piece of paper? So we've used the RSSB safety risk model to have all of their sort of hazard type information. Metrolinx in their hazard record template have got a hazard list as well. So a combination of these various sources we've used to try and help make sure that we've not forgotten about a particular hazard.
Okay, so it's a good reference point, but not
Yeah,
something to like
it's
good
a good
reference
reference.
point.
Yeah, good
Okay.
reference point to help with understanding hazard and risk, but not so good from using it obviously from a quantitative point of view from the UK info into Canada.
Okay. Thank you, Damon. I appreciate it.
That's all right. Yeah, no worries at all. Yeah, no worries. Few people have had to drop off. Is there a course available for CMREA in? So the CMREA stuff. Don't know how to answer that. So technically there is, but actually we do a fair bit of delivery of CMREA with Metrolinx. So I'm not sure where you're based, Anna, but like if you're based in Toronto, then I think Metrolinx try and deliver that course not just to Metrolinx employees, but also to the supply chain. So I can try and provide you with some people to contact in Metrolinx for that. Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one. They wanted to make sure that the same message was getting delivered, so we sort of said that we wouldn't deliver our CMREA training. We'll make sure that we're delivering theirs instead. So might just need to understand how that works a little bit. But so there is courses available, and what I'll do, Anna, I'll make a note and then I'll reach out to the guys in Metrolinx as well, just to see if they're happy for you to sort of maybe put your hand up and try and get onto one of those courses. I know that they're looking to book up courses for the second half of this year. Cool. I can't see any more questions in the chat. I can't see any more hands raised. So I guess really just a quick final call round. Has anyone else got any sort of questions or points that they'd like to raise? Cool.
All good. Thanks, Damon.
I'll let you go.
Thanks, Damon.
Thanks very
Thank
much,
you, David.
everyone.
Appreciate it. Have a
Take
Thank
great
you,
care.
day.
Damon.
Bye.
And
Thank
you.
you so
Speak
much.
soon.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye bye.